According to our calculation, there are over 70 kinds of crops growing here. Many are not planted by us, but they just grow themselves.
According to our calculation, there are over 70 kinds of crops growing here. Many are not planted by us, but they just grow themselves. At first glance, it looked like a desperate move. China put tons of dried plants on a dead mountain. No irrigation, no fertilizer, not even signs of life, just brittle stalks laid across a cracked and lifeless landscape. The costs of artificial materials and machines for transforming sand into soil is lower compared with controlled environmental agriculture and reclamation. To outsiders, it made no sense, but then something unexpected began to happen 3 months later. The result was incredible, and the truth behind it could change how we see land, nature, and even survival itself. The dead mountain. They say mountains are timeless, unchanging, immortal, stoic, but one mountain in northern China tells a different story. For centuries, the rolling hills of the Lost Plateau were fertile and green, cradling civilizations and feeding generations. Today, the same land looks like something from a post-apocalyptic film. Barren, cracked, yellow-brown dust rising with every gust of wind, and deep scars gouged into the earth by erosion. Entire slopes have collapsed into jagged gullies. Rivers, once lifelines of abundance, have dwindled into muddy threads. This is not the remote backwater of some forgotten corner of the planet. This plateau, once revered as the cradle of Chinese agriculture, spans almost 250 square miles, roughly the size of France, cutting across provinces like Shaanxi, Shanxi, and Gansu. And yet, despite its history and size, the Lost Plateau became known by a more tragic title: the most eroded place on Earth. The damage didn't happen overnight. According to reports by the World Bank and various ecologic studies, the land began its decline thousands of years ago as agriculture expanded. Farmers cut down forests to make room for crops. Herds of livestock grazed endlessly, stripping the land of vegetation, and over time, the soft, powdery, lush soil, highly vulnerable to wind and water erosion, began to slip away piece by piece. By the 20th century, the transformation was devastating. Satellite images revealed the extent of the destruction: endless dry ridges stretching into the horizon with little to no greenery in sight. Torrential summer rains would carve out new channels in the hillsides, worsening the erosion. Come spring, powerful dust storms would lift the dry topsoil into the sometimes darkening the skies of distant cities like Beijing and Tianjin. But for those who lived there, the crisis wasn't just about landscape, it was about survival. Farmers struggled to grow crops in the depleted soil. Families already poor were trapped in a cycle of poverty that only deepened with each passing year. Reports from The Guardian and local Chinese development agencies painted a dire picture of a land no longer able to support the people living on it. Fields, once lush with millet, wheat, and corn, were reduced to patches of cracked clay. Children walked long distances to fetch water from wells that were drying up. Dust clung to every surface. Winds were no longer just breezes, they were carriers of despair. Older villagers still remembered when the hills had trees, when rivers ran deep, and when livestock had enough grass to feed on. But those memories were fading fast. In their place, a grim reality had settled in. By the late 1980s, the Yellow River, which snakes through the Lost Plateau, had become one of the most sediment-laden rivers in the world. Nearly 90% of that sediment came from the plateau itself. The erosion was affecting ecosystems and water systems hundreds of miles away. Despite efforts from regional governments to manage the problem, solutions remained elusive. Massive check dams and terraces were occasionally built, but without addressing the root causes: deforestation, overgrazing, and unsustainable farming. They were little more than temporary fixes. Some small-scale reforestation projects began, but nothing on the scale needed to truly shift the tide. International observers, scientists, and policy experts began sounding the alarm. Ecologists warned that without drastic intervention, the Lost Plateau might soon reach a point of no return. And yet, while experts debated strategies and governments filed reports, something remarkable was quietly beginning to stir. In the background, not a flashy mega project, not a high-tech miracle, just a handful of people, scientists, local villagers, and a few government officials, asking a radical question: what if we could bring a dead mountain back to life just by using dried Plants the idea at first glance sounded. Absurd dried vegetation after all is. Dead it crumbles in your hands it feeds. Know when it grows nothing but as unlikely. As it seemed whispers began to emerge. About a pilot project one where bundles of dried grass and shrubs were being placed across desolate hillsides. It didn't make the evening news. There were no dramatic announcements, just the rustle of brittle stems being planted into dry earth. No irrigation systems, no advanced fertilizers, no greenhouses. Just a silent act of defiance against decades of degradation. And then time passed. Weeks became months. Locals waited. Some were skeptical, some were hopeful, but few could have predicted what was about to happen next. What occurred on the Lust Plateau wasn't just a story of ecological recovery, it was something greater, something that in just a few short months would shock not just environmentalists but also economists, scientists, and everyday citizens across the globe. This was a symbol, a metaphor, a battlefield, and what it was about to become would defy everything we thought we knew about land restoration. So how did China bring a dead mountain back to life? By simply covering it with tons of dried plants. The unlikely, the grain for green program solution in 1999, faced with worsening soil erosion and the looming threat of ecological collapse in its heartland, the Chinese government launched a bold experiment unlike any seen before. The initiative was known as the Grain for Green program, and its mission was deceptively simple: retire fragile farmland and restore the landscape by planting trees, shrubs, and grasses, many of which began their journey dry. The program was China's largest ever ecological restoration effort, spanning provinces and involving millions of rural residents. Its roots, however, were driven less by environmental altruism and more by the urgent need for survival. Soil loss was not just destroying the land, it was dragging millions deeper into poverty, threatening water systems downstream and choking entire cities with seasonal dust storms, according to internal policy reports and field studies later published in journals like Hydrology and Earth System Sciences and MDPI Sustainability. The strategy was based on a striking idea: turn steep slope farmland back into forest and grassland. Yet rather than immediately planting trees or lush crops, villagers and volunteers began covering hillsides with bundles of dried grasses, chopped shrubs, and even remnants of previous harvests. These were often tied together into mats or scattered loosely across eroded slopes. The practice was backed by data from soil scientists who argued that even dead vegetation could serve a vital function in an ecosystem on the brink. By laying dried plants directly onto barren hillsides, the goal was to accomplish several things at once. First, the dead matter reduced the force of rainfall, slowing down water runoff that would normally strip away the loose lust soil. Second, it acted as a windbreak, shielding the surface from the brutal gusts that contributed to dust storms. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it created a micro-environment of moisture retention and organic decay. As the dried plants broke down, they slowly enriched the soil with nutrients. Their presence attracted small insects, which in turn encouraged the return of birds and other wildlife. The dry material served as mulch, suppressing weeds while preserving whatever little water the land could still hold in the absence of irrigation systems. This passive method was surprisingly effective at improving the microclimate, just enough for new life to take root. But from the outside, the project didn't look like a miracle. In fact, it looked more like madness. Many observers, including some local scientists and international aid workers, questioned whether dead plants could truly bring life back to the land. The skepticism was deep, and in some cases, vocal agricultural officials were wary of retiring farmland in already impoverished regions. Villagers who had relied on slope terraces for generations were reluctant to give them up for what they saw as a gamble. One of the key early advocates was Li Rui, a senior hydrologist with decades of experience studying the Yellow River Basin. Li had been involved in sediment research and saw firsthand the devastating effects of unchecked erosion. He supported the program, but admitted in early interviews that convincing the public wouldn't be easy, even within the environmental community. The approach was unconventional. Critics pointed out that planting trees was typically done with saplings and irrigation, not with mulch. and prayer and dried vegetation that was usually considered waste, yet for all the doubt there was one undeniable advantage. Scale: the Lust Plateau was too vast, too damaged, and too fragile for conventional methods. Water was scarce, labor was limited, and funds were not infinite. Planting dried materials on mass allowed volunteers to treat thousands of hectares quickly and with minimal cost. It was low-tech and low risk, but potentially high reward. The program wasn't imposed top-down either. It offered incentives. Farmers who gave up their marginal lands were compensated, either in grain subsidies or cash equivalents. This was the other meaning behind grain for green. It wasn't just about planting vegetation, it was about swapping food security in the short term for environmental security in the long run. Households were encouraged to participate, and millions did, according to findings published in PMC and corroborated by researchers working with China's Ministry of Water Resources. The program quickly became one of the largest reforestation efforts in human history. By the early 2000s, entire counties had transformed their farming practices, shifting away from slope-based agriculture to flatter, more manageable plains where trees could be planted. They were where they couldn't. Grasses were introduced first, but the question remained, could this strategy actually work? For months after implementation, the hills looked eerily unchanged. The dried plants, now sunbleached and half-buried in dust, offered little visual evidence of progress. Some farmers began to second-guess their participation. Others voiced concerns that the plateau had already passed the point of no return. Policy documents hinted at internal debates within the state forestry administration and local provincial offices. Would the investment pay off? Had the science been too optimistic? Those closest to the ground, however, the villagers, volunteers, and local ecologists noticed something subtle: small green shoots, tiny insects returning to the earth's soil that for the first time in years didn't blow away with the wind. The skeptics continued to question. After all, rejuvenating one of the most ecologically battered regions on Earth with dead plant matter sounded more like an experiment from a documentary than a national strategy. But the change had already begun, and soon the last plateau would give the world its answer. The transformation. The transformation begins. The silence on the last plateau was once broken only by the dry rattle of wind scraping across barren hills. Now it was interrupted by the rumble of shovels, the echo of pickaxes, and the rhythmic chants of laborers. The first wave of change had arrived in the form of the steady determination of people reclaiming their land one slope at a time. The restoration effort was no longer confined to just laying vegetation. In these early stages, the transformation expanded into structured land engineering, a practice grounded in centuries of traditional Chinese agriculture and now backed by scientific planning. Villagers began constructing terraces, horizontal platforms carved into the hillsides to slow down water runoff and trap nutrient-rich soil. The terracing, a method long used in mountainous farming regions, was brought back with a new purpose: to give nature a foothold. Along with terraces came check dams, small stone or urn barriers built across gullies to reduce water speed during rainfall. These simple structures help trap silt and moisture, allowing the land behind them to gradually level out and stabilize. According to internal documentation from field engineers and ecological analysts, these dams were crucial for halting the erosion that had plagued the region for decades. The work was mechanical but also deeply human. Communities were at the heart of the project. Local farmers, many of whom had spent their entire lives watching the land deteriorate, now became its caretakers under the supervision of village committees and regional land officers. Thousands of residents were trained in soil conservation techniques. Some were given toolkits, others participated in ecological education workshops where they learned about composting, rainwater collection, and rotational grazing. This was now a movement, and as the physical changes began, something else stirred, something unexpected. In the shallow gullies where water once carved deep scars, blades of green began to rise. They were modest at first, tufts of native grasses, hardy shrubs clinging to the soil, and pioneer plants that thrived in dry, degraded environments. But they were alive. As vegetation began to sprout, so too did the return of wildlife. Birds long absent from the region were spotted nesting in newly formed groves. Insects buzzed again over patches of clover and wildflowers, even small. Mammals, hares, voss, and ground squirrels ventured back into the recovering wilderness. It was as if the land long dormant was beginning to breathe soil. Quality also began to shift. Villagers observed that rainwater no longer flowed off the hills like it once did. Instead, the water sank and slowly retained by the terraces, the dams, and the thick mulch layer left by dried vegetation. Reports compiled by local hydrologists described a noticeable reduction in surface runoff, a critical sign that the erosion was slowing down. In some villages, small springs that had dried up years earlier began to trickle again. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, and no one expected it to be, but even within the first few weeks, the change was tangible. Hills that once resembled moonscapes now bore the faint hue of green. The hope was born. This progress was emotional. Farmers who had once given up on their land now spent evenings tending to new saplings. Children who had grown up thinking dust storms were a way of life now played in fields where grass swayed gently in the wind. In interviews documented by ecological journals and advocacy groups like Living Earth, locals spoke with cautious optimism. They didn't dare call it a miracle, but they called it a beginning. The world, for the most part, wasn't watching yet. Outside the region, few knew that an ancient, eroded landscape had started coming back to life thanks to careful planning, local effort, and something as simple as straw and earth. Still, the Lust Plateau was vast, larger than many countries, and its wounds were deep. Many still questioned whether these early signs of recovery would grow into something larger or fade away like so many failed experiments before. The answer was just over the horizon, and when it came, it would leave even the skeptics. The results speechless. The results when China put tons of dried plants on a dead mountain. Many were skeptical, but 3 months later the result was incredible. Only 90 days after the launch of one of the world's most ambitious ecological rehabilitation projects, the results were already staggering. The land that had once choked on its own dust was now draped in green. Where barren hills once stood like skeletal remains of a lost world, a living, breathing landscape had returned. Hardy grasses now held the earth firmly in place. Deep gullies softened under a blanket of shrubs. Even trees, resilient species chosen specifically for the region's arid climate, began to take root and reach skyward. Rain, once an agent of destruction, was now a force of renewal. It no longer slewed away the topsoil. Instead, it seeped into the terraces and nourished newly restored ecosystems. Satellite images compared before and after snapshots of the region and showed the impossible dull browns replaced by bright greens. Erosion lines softened and long dead rivers beginning to flow again with captured rainfall. This was an environmental success, but many now call it a resurrection. Even the president of China himself was quoted as saying that this is unbelievable, and the numbers told their own powerful story. According to a joint report by the World Bank and China's Ministry of Water Resources, vegetation cover in the last plateau increased by over 25% across more than 13,000 square miles of once degraded terrain. This shift fundamentally changed the region's hydrology. Each year, over 100 million tons of sediment are prevented from washing into the Yellow River, once nicknamed China's sorrow for its catastrophic flooding. With the land stabilized and runoff controlled, the river's health improved, benefiting not just the plateau but downstream provinces as well. But the most astonishing transformation was actually human. Over the course of the program, more than 12 million people were lifted out of poverty, once trapped in a cycle of subsistence farming and environmental degradation. Families found new livelihoods in forest management, tourism, and sustainable agriculture. Local schools were rebuilt, infrastructure improved, and communities began to thrive where there was once only dust and despair. A grandmother, Yan, one of the core restoration zones, told interviewers from the environmental education media project that her grandchildren no longer coughed through dust storms and could play under real trees, not ones drawn in school books. "I never thought I'd see this in my lifetime," she said, and she wasn't alone. The restoration of the last plateau garnered international attention, not only because of its speed, but because of its scale. Countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America sent delegations to Observe the process. The United Nations labeled it one of the most successful examples of large-scale ecologic restoration ever attempted, but what made it work? It wasn't just the planting of vegetation, although that was the centerpiece. It was the integrated model, combining government investment, scientific research, local labor, and traditional knowledge. Farmers were paid not to farm on steep slopes. Communities received education and support to switch from short-term exploitation to long-term sustainability. Every tree, dam, and terrace was part of a larger strategy designed to repair the land and empower its people. What was once described as a region past the point of recovery was now proof that recovery was not only possible, but it could be rapid, robust, and revolutionary. This is what makes the story of the last plateau so unforgettable. It isn't just about science or policy or planting trees. It's about hope, about giving up the idea that certain places are beyond saving. It's about reminding us that even the most broken lands, like the most broken systems, can change. And while the world's attention often drifts from one crisis to another, here in the LSS plateau, something rare occurred. A solution that worked, a solution that turned dust into bloom, decay into growth, and despair into a new way forward. The global success. And so what started as a localized project to heal one of China's most degraded regions quietly evolved into something far larger, a global blueprint for ecological restoration. For decades, policymakers and scientists had regarded large-scale land degradation as a near irreversible process. Desertification, they said, was a one-way street driven by climate shifts, deforestation, overgrazing, and poor agricultural practices. But the transformation of the last plateau challenged that assumption. It proved that human-driven restoration could not only stop environmental collapse, but reverse it. Soon the world began to ask a new question: could this work elsewhere? In nations like Ethiopia, Rwanda, India, and Peru, where landscapes bear the scars of decades of overuse, development agencies and governments turned to the last plateau for answers. According to reports from environmental think tanks and international knows, these regions began adapting parts of the model, including terracing, water catchment systems, and incentives for sustainable land use. One key lesson echoed through every case: community participation was essential. In the last plateau, villagers were not passive recipients of aid or instructions. They were hired, trained, and empowered. They helped build terraces, plant vegetation, and monitor progress. Their traditional knowledge of local weather patterns, soil behavior, and crop cycles was integrated into the planning process. This approach generated not just ecological improvements, but a sense of ownership, a social contract with the land. According to development insiders familiar with the program, this shift in mindset was as important as the physical restoration. It taught communities to view the environment not as a resource to extract from, but as a living system they were part of and responsible for. That's why organizations like the United Nations Environment Program and the World Resources Institute now cite the last plateau as a case study in nature-based solutions. Instead of relying on artificial interventions, the strategy focused on harnessing ecological principles: plant cover to prevent erosion, natural water flow to